Right. Across the continent, there's a drive to raise revenues and hopefully directed towards investment, whether it's through taxes and through foreign direct investment or foreign portfolio investment, whatever it is. We are seeing, and some nations are successful at that. We are seeing those financial flows. I think the question now would be, how do we ensure that that money that is coming in, revenues that are getting higher, is actually directed towards development, national, regional, continental development, as opposed to the gap between the rich and the poor just broadening, the rich getting richer and the poor. I mean, that inequality. How do we ensure that the financial flows are actually having a sustainable impact on the people?
So it's a good question. And the way I would respond to it is to say it's important to unpack the concept, the idea of financial flows. And what I mean by that is there could be different types of flows. So you've referenced foreign direct investment, that's a type of flow. If you contract debt in foreign currency, that could be a kind of flows of resources. If you tax citizens, that's tax revenue, that's a kind of flow of financial resources. Now, all of these things have implications. You could have money smuggled into a country, that's a kind of flow.
Yeah.
So first you unpack it, and then for each one of them, there will be different implications. When you make choices about taxation as a source of revenue, for instance, and to tie to your question about how do we make sure that we're not doing things that deepen, say, inequalities. Now, tax and the way in which you impose taxation can be a very interesting instrument. It can either deepen inequalities or it can redress it. And that's a choice that the state makes. So all of these decisions, in the end, are policy decisions and they are choices that have consequences. Mm-hmm. So I think importantly, you need to unpack what type of flows you're talking about. The role of regulation is important. And the reason why, and I think the session we had just before this conversation, we're looking at the role of the central bank, right? And we're talking all about what role the state can play in regulating. Mm-hmm. In many instances, like in most African countries, you don't quite see the role of the state as a regulator. So, and why is that? That's because most of our states are practicing neoliberal economics, which is more about, hands-off. The state should be very hands-off. Now, I think all our conversations since yesterday are talking more about finding a role for the state for it to make a difference. And that matters. If you want to tackle inequalities, which are very entrenched, who has the power and the ability to enact policies and take actions that can actually reverse it? I think that would bring perspective to how far it matters for the state to have the ability and to make the sort of choices that will make a difference. Mm-hmm. Now, what we have right now is a state that makes choices that sometimes you ask yourself. So to the question you asked about how you tackle inequalities, you're not sure that they're training their eyes on doing things or implementing economic policy in a way that can transform lives for the better. And why do I say that? I say that because if you think about sectors that can be transformative, so, the things that will make a difference is if you encourage production, for instance, you may then create jobs. So if you think of Africa, you have so many young people without jobs. If the state was investing in enhancing productive capacities in manufacturing, for example, we were talking about industrial policy. These are the sorts of things that if you invested in consistently, you perhaps would expand the scope within which you can create jobs that transform lives, so that you don't only depend on like informality. You know how informal Africa is. Right. So it's a scenario where people go to school. When you leave school, when you leave college, when you leave university, you're on your own. You look for jobs that don't exist. Mm-hmm. So everybody then is having to be creative and innovative about how to survive. But we could do better because we could do things to invest in productive sectors and productive capacity in our economies in a way that can create the jobs that will then service, say, the need for jobs, the need for dignified lives, so that people have livelihoods that are decent. And I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. It does. And I like that you brought up young people, and we see what Ideas is doing, especially with the Young Scholars Workshop. Why is there that need to be intentional about carrying young people along with economic development across the continent?
So Ideas is the International Development Economics Associates. It's a Global South organization, so led from the Global South. 3 years ago, the headquarters of Ideas moved to Africa from India. It's now located within the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. This was very deliberate. So ideas connects intellectuals, economists who think about economics differently across the three continents of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The deliberate focus on young scholars is intentional. All the seasoned experts within ideas are people who are very passionate about trying to support and mentor a cadre of younger economists. And why does that matter? It means that when they're still under training, you have the opportunity and the possibility perhaps to influence their perspectives, expose them to other ideas of economics. So economics is not only neoclassical economics. Economics doesn't only need to be about propagating neoliberal thinking. So the people at Ideas are deliberately heterodox, which means that the way in which they approach the economy or economic policy is very different. So this is what we do with the young scholars. So for every convening that we have, we always invest in teaching sessions that are 2 days. In this particular case, we're doing it for 3 days. And you target younger, upcoming students of economics, sometimes undergraduates, but mostly people who are second level degree. And the hope there is that you expose them to other ideas of thinking, and they have access to our team of experts. We have a lot of resources that are available online. So we're hoping that with that exposure, they will be more all-rounded in terms of perspectives, so that the dogma that is neoliberal economics on our continent, we hopefully can counter it by exposing them to different ways of thinking. So as you've seen the way the sessions are, they're very interactive.
Yeah.
We bring a very interesting combination of experts. They're very powerful in the way in which they expound on the issues. Hopefully then it is of value to all the young people who have been able to be part of this.
Yeah, and the goal, like you said, is to trigger new ways of thinking, rethinking economic development and how we've been taught economics, especially from the West. And we know that this conference as well focuses on ECOWAS at 50, and I think that brings us to the role of the regional blocs in economic development. We know that, in quotes, Africa is awake, and we are seeing shifts, especially with awareness like this being driven. So what role has ECOWAS played, and should it be playing in that shift to a more multipolar world, especially as it has turned 50 this year?
Yeah. So, 50 years is a long time, can also be a short time, but it's a good time to take stock. The regional integration projects in Africa need to be interrogated. Why do I say that? They are very much modeled according to very neoliberal outlook. There's no doubt that we'll do better with a more integrated Africa. I was joking about my journey here to this conference. I left from Ghana. I left in the morning. I got to Dakar late in the night. And why is that the case? Because there aren't any direct flight connections between Ghana and Dakar. Now that gives me perspective. If you're talking about integrating the continent, surely it should be possible to move faster. Somebody who leaves France and is coming directly to Dakar will get there before me. They'll be on a 6-hour flight, direct. So the perspective I'm talking about is, where do we lay our emphasis or our attention when we talk about regional integration? So ECOWAS has done well on movement of persons. I think it's relatively easy. There are no barriers in terms of that you need a visa or so on to move from one country to the other.
Yeah.
But I've just described what is a practical barrier, which is that even if you wanted to move and you're able to afford it, there isn't an easy connection.
Right.
So that's already a barrier right there. So although we are preaching and talking about integration, we're not doing the things that are actually making it a more of a reality. I know ECOWAS has done well on maybe peace and security. I don't think ECOWAS has done very well on economic integration. So that if you think about the question of how much trade is happening between the countries, ECOWAS states. I think that's an interesting one to focus on. I think that when you look at it, you probably find that it isn't as much as one would like. So, and what are the reasons? The reasons will have to do with things like non-tariff barriers to trade. So there will be things that need to be unpacked about it. So I think we have a long journey and we have a long way to go in terms of making integration a project that's actually about uniting and bringing people together. That's about trying to create a zone of prosperity for all Africans. And I think that if the aspirations were around putting people at the heart of the integration projects and not just following a template, because sometimes to me it feels like we're following the template of the European Union, the way in which they have done integration.
Not thinking for
Not
ourselves.
thinking about what will suit us.
What
is that vision that some of our Pan-Africanists of a long time ago had in mind when they're thinking about bringing the continent together? What are those things that will make that possible? How do you enhance connectivity? So back to the connectivity question I talked about, traveling across the continent is still very, very difficult. And even in the sub-region, as I've just described, you must unlock those things. It must be possible for people to be able to live and to work and to do business across the different countries of the continent. We cannot, you cannot ignore like the security question, because that's a whole other issue as well, which has direct implications on how regional integration takes place. And the role of external forces, external players on how we do our integration project. So I think one needs our leaders to be more visionary, but also more, they should think more differently about how we actually, undertake integration.
And ECOWAS, they've had a number of countries step away from the regional bloc. So that's a whole nother conversation.
Are we talking about the Sahelian states?
Yes.
I think it was incredible that at a time when the states were taking bold steps to uphold their own sovereignty, you would have thought that perhaps ECOWAS should have expressed solidarity, but they did the opposite. They threatened to sanction them. So with that having happened, and they called their bluff, and they left. So then what? You see? And a lot of people are very excited about the experiment that they're undertaking. When I talk to people, like I'm from Kenya, a lot of Kenyans are very motivated and inspired by Traore, because they think that he's daring, he's trying to do some different things. And what are those different things? He's asking for better terms for mining contracts, for example. He's trying to build industry. He's trying to do the sorts of things that we were talking about earlier, ensuring that you're investing in productive capacities, ensuring that you're upholding the sovereignty of your nation, that you're trying to think about economic policy and economics in a manner that is not shackled by the things that have kept the rest of Africa in debt. It takes, being bold and being daring, and it can't be easy. It seems to me many times our leaders choose what they think and they perceive to be the easier option. But I think one has to take the more difficult.
So what does this now mean for ECOWAS, 50-year-old, right? This opposition or some sort of solidarity from some people with the likes of Traore, who have pulled out and away from ECOWAS as regional bloc. And ECOWAS boldly opposing such moves. What does it mean for the future of ECOWAS?
So it's hard to say, because ECOWAS has also had moving targets in different things. So, like the idea of the common currency, that's kept being a moving target. So one has to ask the question about what's the premise upon which this integration has been built. If you value integration, then you should value each and every member. You should do everything to try and ensure that everybody is under the tent, right? And even if you have to have disagreements, I think there has to be mechanisms around which you still forge solidarity that keeps everybody together. So I think leadership also matters, because I have seen a lot of overtures which are encouraging, from like the current president of Ghana to these Sahelian states. I think he's making moves that suggest to me that there are people who may be thinking from the ECOWAS tent that it's better to try and have conversations and dialogue that might eventually mean that perhaps they are back, or at least that there's a mechanism through which there's still cooperation, so that they're not excluded from serving. Because I also think that it makes no sense to say they're excluded. They are part of the region and the sub-region.
Thank you so much for your time and perspective, Atieno, Ndomo, the social policy analyst.
Thank you very much for having me.